The story takes place in the fertile, eastern territories guarded by the gods and bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. Empires are founded, wars are waged, alliances are formed, and heroes are created in the cradle of ancient civilization. Agamemnon, Brian Cox, king of Mycenae, has united most of Greece's kingdoms under his dominion and now advances his army on Thessaly, aiming to add it to his ever-growing conquests. Instead of fighting openly, King Triopa, Julian Glover, deals with Agamemnon to allow one of their greatest fighters to decide who wins the combat. Triopa summons the enormous Boagrius, Nathan Jones, while Agamemnon summons Achilles, who is nowhere to be seen. A messenger boy, Jacob Smith, is dispatched to retrieve him, and Agamemnon curses the tenacity of Greece's fiercest warrior. Achilles, a half-god endowed with unparalleled power and skill, lives to fight, but he rejects to unite with Agamemnon, choosing to seek his own fate and be immortalized in history. Achilles easily overcomes Boagrius, effectively securing Agamemnon's dominance of the nation, and asks if there is anyone else worthy of fighting him. Triopa gives Achilles the scepter of Thessaly to pass on to Agamemnon. Achilles declines the request and walks away. Meanwhile, as honored guests and peace ambassadors to their home country, Prince Hector, Eric Bana, and Paris, Orlando Bloom, of Troy dine in the dining hall of King Menelaus of Sparta, Brendan Gleeson. Young Paris, on the other hand, slips away to be with Menelaus' gorgeous wife, Helen, Diane Kruger, whom he adores. He persuades her to return to Troy with him, stowing her away on his brother's ship. When Hector discovers the truth, he is plainly enraged, but it is too late to return to Sparta with Helen and seek forgiveness. Menelaus pledges vengeance on Troy and seeks the agreement of his brother, Agamemnon, who is only too pleased to oblige, albeit Agamemnon's choice is mostly motivated by his desire to sack Troy, the seemingly unbeatable city. Odysseus, Sean Bean, king of Ithaca and under Agamemnon's leadership, travels to persuade Achilles to join them in their conquest of Troy. He discovers him sparring with his little cousin, Patroclus, Garrett Hedlund, who is eager to join in on the action. Despite Odysseus' assurance that this war will be remembered, Achilles refuses to go. Later, Achilles seeks guidance from his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, Julie Christie, who is gathering shells for him to build a new necklace. She promises him that if he stays at home, he will marry, raise a family, and die old and loved. If he gets to Troy, he will discover immortal glory, and his name will be remembered for thousands of years. However, if he goes to Troy, he will perish and never return. Meanwhile, Hector and Paris, accompanied by Helen, arrive to Troy and are received joyfully by their fellow Trojans. Since its inception, the city has been protected by a high, thick wall that has remained impenetrable. They are welcomed by their father, King Priam, Peter O'Toole, who compliments Helen on her beauty. Hector is reunited with his wife and young son, Andromache, Saffron Burrows. Achilles decides to join Agamemnon's battle against Troy, but he brings his own men, the famed Myrmidons led by Eutorus, Vincent Regan. Patroclus joins them as well. The Myrmidons outrace the Greeks in rowing and arrive on the shores of Troy before anybody else. Achilles delivers an impassioned speech to his warriors, reminding them that the campaign will immortalize them. Achilles tells Patroclus to stay and watch the ship out of concern for his cousin's safety and inexperience. The Myrmidons easily conquer the shore and raid the temple of Apollo, where the priestess and cousin of Hector in Paris, Briseis, Rose Byrne, is kidnapped. Achilles decapitates the statue of Apollo in defiance, ignoring Eutorus' advice not to insult the gods. To keep the Greeks at bay, Prince Hector leads an offensive and dashes into the temple, where Achilles meets him but refuses to fight him. Achilles says that their conflict would be better served in front of an audience, so he lets Hector go. As a prize, Briseis is brought to Achilles' cabin. She chastises him for slaying Apollo priests before summoning him to visit Agamemnon, who is ready to celebrate the victory. Tensions grow as Achilles and the monarch fight about victory claims. Agamemnon takes it a step further by bringing in Briseis and claiming her as his personal spoil of war, which enrages Achilles. He threatens to fight for her, but she responds fiercely, claiming that no one else will die for her. To Agamemnon's surprise, Achilles keeps his blade still. Achilles swears that Agamemnon will fall under his blade one day. That night, with his sons present, Priam asks advice from his advisors and elders on how to effectively defend against the Greeks. Paris provides an alternative to violence by fighting Menelaus for Helen's hand. The winner will take her home, while the loser will be burned before the end of the night. Later, in a courtyard, Priam confesses to Paris that, of all the conflicts he's fought for power or land, a war fought for love makes more sense. He bestows on Paris the sword of Troy, fashioned at the city's inception and containing the history of their people. He explains that as long as a Trojan wields it, their people have hope. Hector visits his wife and son. She is terrified for his life and cannot imagine living without him. Before going to see his brother, he consoles her. In the halls, he notices a cloaked person and pursues her, only to discover that it is Helen attempting to flee the city. She is sorry for being the single cause of so many Trojan deaths that day, but Hector assures her that returning to Menelaus will not end the war and that she is now a princess of Troy. Helen has returned to Paris. The next day, Agamemnon's army marches for Troy, as Achilles watches from a nearby hill with his soldiers, still enraged over his loss of Briseis. Before the battle, Hector and Paris ride out to meet Agamemnon and Menelaus. Agamemnon orders the Trojans to restore Helen to his brother and submit to his reign. Hector boldly refuses, but Paris offers to fight Menelaus one-on-one in the hopes of settling the quarrel. While Agamemnon is unconcerned about delivering Helen to his brother, he does provide Menelaus the opportunity to get retribution. Menelaus is plainly the strongest of the two as the fight begins. Paris, fighting on his brother's suggestion to wait until Menelaus tires, is wounded and disarmed, but dives away and crawls back to his brother before Menelaus can strike a fatal blow. Menelaus, shocked by his cowardice, demands that the fight continue, but Hector defends his brother and drives his sword through Menelaus, killing him. Enraged, Agamemnon leads his soldiers forward. Achilles, watching from his hilltop, blames Agamemnon's inability to keep his lines in formation. Hector proves to be the more capable warrior, and his tactics overwhelm the Greeks. Ajax, Tyler-Mane, one of the most powerful Greek soldiers, is defeated by Hector. Agamemnon is advised by Odysseus to evacuate before losing his entire army, and the Greeks retreat to the beach, where their archers offer defense. With Menelaus dead, the fundamental motive for the attack on Troy has passed, and Agamemnon is at a loss for how to rouse the warriors to his cause. Odysseus advises Agamemnon to set aside his qualms and enlist Achilles to battle once more. Outside, Briseis is being flung around by Greek soldiers after being surrendered to them by Agamemnon. Achilles intervenes and takes her back to his hut before she is severely branded. He hands her a wet cloth to clean with as well as some food. When she asks why he battles and defies the gods, he reveals a more contemplative side of himself and explains that the gods are envious of men because of their short, mortal lives. As a result, everything looks better. Priam confers with his advisors once again, while Paris bemoans his cowardice. Helen informs him that, despite Menelaus' strength as a warrior, she despised her life with him. She'd rather love and grow old with someone than see him perish on the battlefield. Hector tells his father not to underestimate Trojan strength as the Greeks did. General Glaucus, James Cosmo, on the other hand, wishes to attack first. High Priest Archeptolemus, Nigel Terry, asserts that the gods favor Troy, citing bird omens. Priam ignores Hector's advice to stay outside their fortifications and launches an attack before dawn. Briseis takes a dagger and holds it to Achilles' throat while he sleeps that night. He encourages her to kill him without opening his eyes, but she hesitates. They recognize their feelings for one another and fall in love. Achilles has had enough of war and offers to transport Briseis away from Troy. Following that, he chats with Euderus and informs him that they will return home. Patroclus is upset since he had hoped to participate in the war. Achilles goes back to his hut. The Trojan army, led by Hector, set up on the dunes as dawn approached and fired hundreds of flaming arrows into the sand. The Greeks awakened to find big bales of hay being thrown down the slope towards camp, burned in massive fireballs by the charred arrows. The Trojans advanced towards the Greek camp, banging their shields to scare their adversary. Achilles appears in his armor, rallying the men to attack. Achilles fights his way towards Hector, and the two fight. Greeks and Trojans alike surround and pursue them until Hector slashes Achilles' throat with a single sweep of his sword. Achilles collapses, gasping for air, as the Myrmidons watch in despair. When Hector removes his helmet, he realizes that the man he has injured is Patroclus, not Achilles. Hector, regretful but steadfast, thrusts his blade into the boy's chest to kill him. He addresses Odysseus and tells him they've had enough fighting that day. Odysseus informs Hector, before departing, that Patroclus is Achilles' cousin. As Achilles emerges from his tent, the Myrmidons return to camp. When he sees their battle scars, he wonders why they defied him. Euderus bemoans the fact that Patroclus disguised himself in Achilles' armor and even moved like him before succumbing to Hector. Achilles gets enraged and launches an attack on Euderus. Briseis tries to stop him, but he throws her down. Hector goes back to his wife. He admits to killing a far too young youngster and believes that his actions will have serious consequences. He shows his wife a subterranean route beneath Troy that she can use to transport civilians to the mountains if he dies and the walls are overrun. Despite her displeasure at having to ponder the proposal, she follows his suggestion. Achilles places his cousin on a funeral pyre and lights it on fire. "That boy may have just saved the war for us," Agamemnon observes, knowing that Achilles' fury would not subside until he has exacted his revenge. In the meantime, Helen observes Paris practicing his archery in preparation for combat, striking his target with growing accuracy. The next morning, Achilles goes out to exact revenge on Hector. Briseis begs him not to leave, but he dismisses her. He leads his chariot to the gates of Troy and summons Hector, who dresses in his armor and bids his wife farewell. He meets Achilles outside on his own. Achilles removes his helmet so Hector can see his face. Despite Hector's best efforts, Achilles is consumed by bloodlust. As they begin to battle, Priam and Paris stand by, while Helen consoles Andromache, who is unable to look. The two engage in a ferocious combat, smashing one another's spears. Hector trips over an embedded stone and is commanded to stand and restart the battle by his opponent. Achilles defeats Hector by thrusting the tip of a spear into his chest and finishing him with his sword. He then binds Hector's legs behind his chariot and pulls him back to the beach, as the Trojans watch in despair. Briseis calls out and begs when the murdering will end before returning to his hut. Achilles is visited that night by a stranger in a cloak. Before exposing himself as King Priam, the stranger kisses Achilles' hand. Priam pleads for the return of his son's body to be given a suitable burial after sneaking into the Greek camp unobserved. He reminds Achilles that while Hector murdered his cousin, he had no idea who it was, and he asks Achilles how many cousins and brothers he had killed in his time. Despite the fact that they are enemies, he requests respect. Achilles gives in. He weeps over Hector's body and promises to see him again in the next world before handing him over to Priam. When Briseis approaches Achilles, he permits her to return home and apologizes for hurting her. He promises Priam that the Greeks would not attack Troy for 12 days in order to allow for proper mourning. Agamemnon is enraged when he learns of Achilles' secret contract with Priam. Odysseus, who notices a horse sculpture done by a fellow soldier for his son, devises a strategy that takes advantage of the 12 days of grief. After 12 days, the Trojans discover that the beach has been abandoned and that several bodies have been discovered in the sand. They appear to have been taken by sickness, and a big wooden horse has been constructed in place of the camp's heart. The horse was left as a gift to the god Poseidon, and Priam is persuaded to bring it back to Troy. Paris, who is skeptical, pushes his father to fire the horse right once, but Priam brings it into the city, where it is cherished as a symbol of the end of the battle. A Trojan scout trekking through the cliffs outside the city discovers the Greek armada concealed in a cove separate from the main beach. However, before he can warn the rest of Troy, he is murdered by an arrow. Meanwhile, the entire city is celebrating late into the night. After the horse has calmed down, Achilles, Odysseus, and a small force of Greek soldiers emerge, slaying numerous guards and opening Troy's gates. While Priam weeps, the Greek army rushes into the city, pillaging and burning homes and slaughtering every Trojan who stands in their path. Soldiers from Troy attempt but fail to defend the royal residence. As Priam prays before the statue of Apollo, wondering why he has been abandoned, Agamemnon comes up behind him and stabs him in the back. Meanwhile, Achilles explores the city for Briseis. Paris and Andromache bring the remaining citizens down to the hidden passage, where Paris hands the sword of Troy to a young child, Aeneas, Frankie Fitzgerald, a progenitor of the Romans, recounting what his father taught him. He then returns with his bow and arrow to assist in the struggle. Briseis is worshipping before an Apollo statue when Agamemnon grabs her from behind. Achilles discovers them and comes to her aid. Agamemnon informs Briseis of his intention to take her back to Greece as his slave before she fatally stabs him in the neck with a concealed knife. His guards approach her, but Achilles kills them all. Paris enters while he is assisting her and shoots an arrow through Achilles' left heel. Despite Briseis' protests, Achilles is shot through the chest again as he stands up to face Paris. He takes out the arrow only to be shot numerous times more. He eventually collapses and tells Briseis that she was his piece in a lifetime of conflict, urging her to flee. Briseis joins Paris as the Greeks arrive at the palace to find Achilles dead, allegedly from a single shot to the heel, thus continuing the story surrounding his death. The following day, Achilles' body is burnt honorably on a funeral pyre within the remains of Troy, as Odysseus observes and exclaims, "If they ever tell my story, let them say I walked with giants. Men come and go like winter wheat, but these names endure. Let them claim I lived during the reign of Hector, the horse tamer. Let them say I lived during Achilles' reign."